Circumcision was not something I ever really thought about until I had two sons. When you have a baby boy, a decision is suddenly thrust upon you, at least in the United States. I mean, there's lots of decisions thrust upon you. What are we going to name him? What about a middle name? What kind of diapers should we buy? Which car seat? Lots of questions. Lots of decisions. One of them is next level, though, because at some point, someone is going to ask you if you want to cut off part of your baby's penis. And you have to make that decision. I had never really thought about it until then. And not one to make ill-informed decisions, my mind was suddenly full of questions. The main one being, why? Why do well over half of Americans cut off part of their newborn son's genitalia? Where did circumcision even come from, and what caused it to explode as a practice in the U.S. over the last less than 150 years? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and this is History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. Circumcision has been on my list of topics since the literal inception of this podcast. It has been penciled in on the schedule and then replaced with something else time and time again. I don't know why I kept putting it off, but it is finally time. It is time to talk about the history of circumcision and get to the bottom of that question, why? Why are we doing this kind of crazy thing on such a massive scale? Because here's the thing, while circumcision rates hover at around 60% in the United States today, if you could go back to the 1850s, that rate would drop off precipitously. At that point, the only people circumcising their babies were doing it for religious reasons, because they were either Jewish or Muslim. So what happened? Well, we'll get to that, but let's take it all the way back to the beginning first. Circumcision is actually the oldest surgical procedure that we know about. In fact, circumcised penises, I'm going to be saying the word penis a lot, sorry about that, but circumcised penises appeared depicted in Paleolithic art from as far back as 40,000 years ago in France, Spain, and the Sahara. This predates evidence of trepanation, which I know I've talked about before. Trepanation is drilling a hole into someone's skull for medical reasons to relieve pressure on the brain or whatever. It's the earliest surgical procedure for which we have actual archaeological evidence, actual skulls with holes drilled in them from at least 10,000 years ago. But while we don't have bones to prove that circumcision was being done, it's in that Paleolithic art. So we know that it was being done some 30,000 years before trepanation. Now, we don't get our first sort of forensic evidence until around 6,000 years ago in the form of ancient Egyptian circumcised mummies. But the artwork suggests that it's been done for at least the last 40,000 years. According to an article in the Journal of Pediatric Surgery, circumcision likely got its start as a form of genital mutilation that would have been inflicted on prisoners of war. So typically, the preferred form of genital mutilation here would be castration, the cutting off of the testicles. This was often done as a punishment for, like I said, prisoners of war, but it was also sometimes done for religious reasons as sort of like a religious sacrifice sort of thing. It's very likely that circumcision emerged as a less brutal form of genital mutilation than castration. It was like a leveled down version of castration. Because, if you're going to be doing it for religious reasons, as like a sacrifice sort of thing to show your piety, kind of nice to have that option, right? What I find really interesting, though, is the way that circumcision emerges in various parts of the world. So we have a lot of evidence of it in ancient Egypt, and we'll talk about that more next. But we also know that it was done in Australia among the Aboriginal people there, and in Central and South America, Indigenous Americans were also doing it. Now, this is very interesting because these three groups, Egyptians, Australian Aboriginal, and the indigenous people of the Americas, had no contact with each other, right? So it's not like the Aztecs were like, hey, look what they're doing to their penises in Egypt. We should do that too. They all came up with this idea independently. I don't know what that says about humans, that we would all naturally trend in this very strange direction, but that seems to be what happened. So let's talk about circumcision in Egypt. Evidence of circumcision in the form of engravings on walls dates back to around 8,000 years ago in Egypt. And then, of course, there are the mummies who had been circumcised from around 6,000 years ago. While we think it may have started as a form of punishment, as I said, it eventually entered the realms of religion. At some point, Egyptian priests and nobility adopted the practice. We don't really know why. It was likely associated with purity and spiritual and intellectual development. It seems to have been done as like a rite of passage in a very public ceremony, mostly just among the elite. It was like a mark of distinction for the elite. It set them apart as greater than that they publicly chopped off part of their penis for some reason. So there's mention in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that the sun god Ra circumcised himself. So it's clearly a very honorable thing to do, right? This very honorable god did it. It's something that's seen as favorable, which is ironic considering it likely started as punishment for prisoners. So full 180 at some point happening here. It goes from marking the lowest of the low to marking the highest of the high. Probably during their time spent enslaved in Egypt, Jewish people eventually adopted the tradition of circumcision for religious reasons. The practice is prominently mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. According to the Torah, Abraham and God enter into a little agreement. It says, quote, "This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every male among you shall be circumcised." End quote. So then Abraham circumcises himself at the age of 99, and he also circumcises his many sons and the men that he enslaved. And so here we see a sort of deviation from it being a thing only the elite do, because Abraham is circumcising enslaved men as well. Now, in the Jewish religion, at least, every man is doing it regardless of social status, whereas in Egypt, it was more of like an elite thing, right? But here we have Abraham doing it. We also have the enslaved men doing it. Jesus, being Jewish, is also mentioned as being circumcised 8 days after he is born. Today, circumcision is still almost universally practiced among Jewish populations 8 days after birth. Why? Because of Abraham's covenant with God. Now, does God say why he wants all the boys circumcised? Unfortunately, no, not really. It's just a sign. It's a physical sign of this covenant. So it leaves us to wonder somewhat. It seems like a blood sacrifice. I mean, remember, God also told Abraham to kill his son Isaac as a sacrifice in order to test his faith, and then thankfully was like, nope, stop, never mind. But good job being willing to do it. That was a test. So sacrifices in the name of God are definitely a thing, which is interesting because we tend to think of blood sacrifices and like human sacrifice as more of a pagan thing now, but whatever. Some scholars have also proposed, though, that circumcision was likely done to make hygiene easier in hot, sandy climates where Jewish people lived. But typically the reason given is just religious reasons. And I guess that's reason enough. Just because God said so. He doesn't have to have a reason, just get to chopping, right? Blind faith, baby. Ancient Greeks, on the other hand, were very opposed to circumcision, which can clearly be seen in the artwork they left behind. Lots of uncircumcised penis statues and whatnot. They were super okay with male nudity. It wasn't like they were like squeamish about it or anything. They did like naked wrestling and all that just fine. But circumcised penises were seen as grotesque and were really very taboo in ancient Greek society. In fact, in 168 BC, King Antiochus IV made circumcision punishable by flogging, crucifixion, or stoning. Serious offense, right? When Alexander the Great, who was Greek, when he conquered the Middle East in the 300s BC and spread Greek culture all through that area and into Egypt, he brought anti-circumcision Greek values with him. And this was a problem for Jewish people, of course, to whom it was a very important religious ritual, essentially mandatory in their religion. Rules against circumcision were often used in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, actually, to force Jewish people to assimilate. So a big motive of Antiochus IV's anti-circumcision law in 168 BC was likely to punish Jewish people and sort of force them to assimilate with Greek society. Although it's never actually mentioned outright in the Quran, Muslims also pretty much universally practice circumcision. They are the largest religious group to do so. In Islam, it's a form of purification and a confirmation of their relationship with God. And Islam is also an Abrahamic faith, like Judaism. Muslims trace their roots back to Abraham as well. Two of Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael, respectively serve as patriarchs for Judaism and Islam. So it all goes back to Abraham and that covenant with God. What about Christians, though? Right? Christianity is also an Abrahamic religion. Does the covenant apply to Christians? No, it doesn't seem to. Even though Christ, the guy the whole religion is based on, was circumcised 8 days after birth as a Jewish person, Christians were like, nah, we'll pass on that. Not going to do that part. In the New Testament of the Bible, actually, Paul wrote in Galatians 5:6, quote, "In Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision count for anything," end quote. Also, a papal bull issued in 1442 by the Roman Catholic Church said, quote, "Therefore, it strictly orders all who glory in the name of Christian not to practice circumcision either before or after baptism, since whether or not they place their hope in it, it cannot possibly be observed without loss of eternal salvation," end quote. Meaning, circumcision does nothing to get you closer to God. Essentially, don't place your hope in it. It's not helping you. In a lot of ways, the Christian baptism replaced circumcision as this purifying rite of passage that confirmed a relationship with God. Christians are using baptism for that purpose instead of circumcision like the Jews and the Muslims. And so, for a very long time, circumcision was a religious ritual used almost exclusively by Jewish people and Muslims. White male Christians were not doing it. No way. So what happened? Well, we have to fast forward all the way to 1855. This was the first time that anyone suggested circumcision might have health benefits. And that timing makes a lot of sense because mid to late 1800s was really the emergence of modern medicine. There's germ theory coming out, this new idea that people are getting sick because of microscopic organisms, that sort of thing. So this idea that circumcision might have health benefits started with a British physician named Jonathan Hutchinson. Hutchinson started noticing that Jewish people that he treated were much less likely to have syphilis. Based on this observation, he suggested that circumcision reduced your chances of getting syphilis, which it does actually seem to, based on more recent observational studies done in Africa. So for the next 50 years of Hutchinson's career, he advocated for circumcision for health reasons. He was really the first person to do this. Now, over in the United States, another guy becomes an advocate for totally different health-related reasons. In 1870, an orthopedic surgeon named Louis Sayre, who also happened to be vice president and part founder of the American Medical Association, was presented with a troubling case. A 5-year-old boy had been referred to him for contracture of the legs, which is a shortening and hardening of the muscles and tendons and whatnot, leading to stiffness and difficulty moving. Because remember, this guy was an orthopedic surgeon. This is like the kind of things he did. The boy was having trouble walking. He was having trouble standing up straight because of this. So Sayer jumps into action. He's trying to figure out how to help this kid, and he decides that the best thing to do is to cut the hamstring tendons, because they're way too short, and then apply an electric current to the muscles, which he assumes must be paralyzed. But before he gets a chance to carry out this questionable scheme, one of the nurses says to him in passing, quote, "Don't touch his pee-pee, it's very sore." So Sayer goes, his pee-pee, you say? And he decides, upon examining it, that this kid needs to be circumcised. So he does that sort of experimentally. He performs a circumcision, and then he reports that the boy was, quote, able to extend his limbs, and in less than a fortnight was able to walk alone, end quote. So Sayer thinks he's onto something here. He starts to believe that circumcision somehow was able to cure paralysis and neuromuscular disease. And he performed 2 additional circumcisions with the same results. And he even claimed that other doctors had sent him letters reporting the same. So Sayer becomes this huge advocate for circumcision in the United States based on these findings. He calls this theory reflex genital irritation. And he wrote, quote, "Peripheral irritation of the foreskin would ultimately produce the loss of controlling power," end quote. Although he admits that he doesn't really understand how or why it works that way, that doesn't stop him from advocating for the circumcision of every male child in the United States. He spoke at many medical meetings, both locally, the New York Medical Society, and worldwide, the International Medical Congress. And remember, he was part founder and current vice president of the AMA, the American Medical Association. So his word carried some clout. Sayer takes things even further, though. He moves past circumcision as a way of curing musculoskeletal problems, and he starts baselessly claiming that it also affects intelligence and behavior. He believed that circumcision could transform a child who was, quote, like a lunatic, into a more civilized and docile person. He's all, little fix your tight hamstrings and make you smarter too. Now, we know that's not true at all. But at his insistence, doctors in the U.S. started performing circumcisions left and right. And even after they realized, as medicine progressed, even after they realized that Sayer's medical claims were complete nonsense and that circumcision had nothing to do with either of those things, they continued to do it while searching for other health reasons to back it up, which seems rather backwards to me. They're like, yeah, I'm sure there's a good reason to do this. Snip, snip, we'll figure it out soon enough. By the turn of the 20th century, circumcision had become universally recommended throughout the English-speaking world. So that's the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, and South Africa. They just start doing it to everyone. Every boy, obviously, they're doing it to every boy. But it didn't catch on like that in the rest of Europe. France, Germany, those countries, they weren't doing it universally there. And experts are sort of puzzled as to why. One major theory deals with attitudes towards Jewish people. So remember, before this, circumcision was very much a Jewish thing. And it's possible Jewish people were more highly respected in countries like the US and Great Britain than they were in, for example, Germany, right? There are a lot of prominent and well-respected Jewish people in these English-speaking countries. Perhaps circumcision being seen as a Jewish thing made it not catch on as much in countries in continental Europe that didn't necessarily value Jewish people the same. After World War II, a clear split happened, though. An article came out in the UK in 1949 by pediatrician Douglas Gardner called The Fate of the Foreskin. This article argued that the risks of circumcision outweighed any known medical benefits, and because of it, circumcision rates dropped dramatically in the UK, down to around 20% today, compared to 60 plus in the US. Because around that same time, the opposite thing was happening in the US. Pediatrician Benjamin Spock was arguing the exact opposite in his book, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Childcare. He was saying that circumcision was worth it and should be done, which led to circumcision rates skyrocketing even further in the US. In the 1970s, both Canada and Australia issued recommendations against routine circumcision. Both countries' national medical associations stated that any potential health benefits did not outweigh the risks and ethical concerns of performing essentially genital mutilation on another person without their consent. So because the risks and benefits were so balanced, they said that it was not actually a medical decision. And so they would no longer recommend it medically. Now, parents could still do it if they wanted to, but it was not a medical decision. It was either religious or it was societal, cultural decision. So basically, every other country that was pushing for routine circumcision dropped out. They were like, actually, never mind. Except for the US. The US continued to push for it based on the word of this Dr. Spock guy who wrote that book, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Childcare. I find it so ironic that baby care advice like this was so commonly coming from men, when for literally ever and always it had been the women almost exclusively who were actually caring for babies. Like, why are we listening to this guy? What does he really know about baby and childcare as a man in the 1940s, right? So today, we see these really interesting statistics where most of the world does not universally practice circumcision as like a routine recommended medical procedure. And it's really mostly just the US doing that, along with South Korea, interestingly, because of American influence after the Korean War. And then some places, of course, do it for religious reasons. These are like predominantly Muslim and Jewish countries who are doing it for religious reasons. But the U.S. is one of the last men standing when it comes to this push for circumcision medically. Why? Are there actual health benefits? What are the health benefits? Well, circumcision is supposed to reduce the risk of urinary tract infections, as well as the transmission of sexually transmitted infections. It also appears to reduce the risk of penile cancer, although that's already exceptionally rare, so not really a huge selling point there. According to Advanced Urological Care, quote, to date, no conclusive evidence-based data is available supporting the medical benefits of circumcision with regard to hygiene, cancer prevention, or HIV prevention, end quote. They also cite a litany of what they call underreported complications, including bleeding, injury, loss of protection from injury, decreased sensitivity, and possible sexual dysfunction later in life, and claim that these are often underreported because currently health insurance covers circumcision in the US. If negative reports were coming out about it that were weighing against these marginal health benefits, they worry that health insurance companies would no longer pay for it. So it's a money thing, of course, because turns out, you guys, Americans spend a reported $5.4 billion every year on circumcisions. If health insurance stops paying for that because of reported complications they then have to pay to fix, a lot of people stop circumcising their boys. That means the medical industry is out $5.4 billion a year. So of course they're pushing for it, and of course they're underreporting complications. None of this surprises me, as in almost all things, simply follow the money trail. Now, there are health benefits to take into account, though, especially the reduced transmission of STIs, most notably HIV, which of course leads to AIDS. Semi-recent studies suggest that circumcision reduces a man's risk of contracting HIV from a female partner by around 60%. So it has been proposed that because of this, circumcision's benefits do outweigh its negatives in countries with high rates of HIV and AIDS, countries in Africa mostly. And it is being used there for that purpose. So there, in those high-risk countries, the scale tips towards circumcision actually having health benefits. But what about here, where that doesn't seem to be the case? Why do so many parents in the United States choose circumcision despite this balance, this sort of stalemate of risk versus benefit that caused other countries, the UK, Canada, Australia, to stop recommending it medically? Why are we so determined to continue it here? Well, a lot of that, unfortunately, is social. According to Dr. Catherine Hankins, chief scientific advisor for UNAIDS, quote, "The desire to conform is an important motivation for circumcision in places where the majority of boys are circumcised," end quote. According to a study carried out in Denver, Colorado, parents, mostly fathers specifically, cited social reasons as the determining factor for deciding to circumcise their baby boys. A UNAIDS article says, quote, "In the Philippines, where circumcision is almost universal," and I'm interjecting here, that's because of religious reasons, and typically occurs at age 10 to 14, a survey of boys found 2/3 of those surveyed choosing to be circumcised simply to avoid being uncircumcised, and 41% stating that it was part of the tradition. Social concerns were also the primary reason for circumcision in South Korea, with 61% of respondents in one study believing they would be ridiculed by their peer group unless they were circumcised, end quote. And I know this comes into play in the United States in a big way, too. I personally remember boys being made fun of in middle school for not being circumcised. I had no idea what that was or that was a thing when I was that age, but I remember people being made fun of for this. I know of one person in particular who chose to get circumcised as a teenager to avoid this kind of ridicule that he had been subjected to. So to sum all that up, there's essentially 3 types of reasons we circumcise boys. Number 1 is religious, specifically if you're Jewish or Muslim. Okay, fine. I mean, the genital mutilation of babies as a form of blood sacrifice or covenant with God seems a bit archaic to me this day and age, but whatever. Not my religion. Who am I to say? The second reason is health-related, the idea that the procedure has health benefits that outweigh all possible complications and ethical concerns, like maybe it does in Africa, right? And then the third reason is social, the fear of being different, of being made fun of for not being circumcised in a country where the majority of boys are. So if we look at the United States, if we look at the reason why some 2/3 of American males are circumcised, it's not religious. I mean, for a handful it is, but for the vast majority, it's not. We're not a majority Jewish or Muslim country, so that's not it. I don't know that we can argue it's health-related at this point either. I know they're clinging to that hard in the medical community, likely due to that $5.4 billion annual circumcision spending. But I think I'm on the side of Canada and Australia and the UK here. Yes, there are some health benefits, but do they outweigh the negatives? If you live in an HIV-prone population in Africa, yeah, they probably do. I think there are health reasons to do it there. But here, I think they're negligible at best. So that leaves us with social reasons. I think the vast majority of Americans are circumcising their boys simply because it's what everyone else does. And they don't want their kid to be the odd man out, a target for ridicule. I really do think that's what it comes down to at this point, and that's really sad. You are willing to chop off a piece of your newborn baby's body without his consent because of a fear of ostracization from society. What is wrong with us? That hints towards serious fundamental societal problems that we can't just treat people with respect regardless of sameness or differences. Maybe we should focus less on the chopping off of the parts of the penis and more on teaching our children to be kind to one another regardless of the status of anyone's penis. I think it's so ironic, and I know I use that word a lot on this show, but so much of history is so very ironic. I think it's so ironic that what most likely started as punishment, right, as like a form of genital mutilation as punishment enacted on prisoners of war, has since transformed into this societal status symbol. Like if you didn't cut off part of your penis, then you're not in the cool kids club. That's insane. And so I think you guys can probably guess by now the decision that I made. I'm not here to tell you whether or not you should chop off part of your baby's penis, of course. Just present you with the backstory so you can hopefully make your own informed decision. I will say, though, looking at the statistics, it's trending downward, even in the U.S., from around 65% of males circumcised in 2012 to 60% in 2022. So, that likely is partly due to the increasing Hispanic population. They don't typically choose circumcision. But I hope it also means that people are starting to actually think about it and weigh the pros and cons a little more and not just do it because everyone else is. That's never a good reason to do anything, especially something as extreme and irreversible as chopping off part of your baby's body. So hopefully you found this thought-provoking. There's a lot of ethics to consider that I didn't even really delve into that deeply. Like I said, I'm not here to pass judgment on anyone who did or didn't choose circumcision. This is not medical advice, obviously, but it's a serious decision. And I think it helps to know the history of where this came from and why we do it. So, consider it fixed. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.